Okay, welcome to another NASA Solar System Ambassador training and our second training on the James Webb Space Telescope and how it is being used by some of our young researchers this week. So this is the last in a series of Universe of Learning science briefings, our last for the year, and I believe this is kind of closing up this series of Universe of Learning briefings. We've had a great collaboration over the last couple of years, so we're so grateful to the Universe of Learning for bringing so many researchers, and especially, um, I can say this because I'm older, some younger people to present their research to our community. So I love that. So I'm going to turn off my camera and start sharing the slides. And my co-host Kelly Lipo from Universe of Learning will be introducing the speakers. And we will take questions after each of the speakers has presented.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. As Sarah said, my name is Dr. Kelly Lipo. I am an education and outreach scientist at the Space Telescope Science Institute in Baltimore, Maryland. And today we're coming to you with what is our very last science briefing. And today we're going to talk about rocky exoplanets with the James Webb Space Telescope. But just before we get into that, I would just like to say a little bit about the science briefing. So the science briefings is a very long-running series. It started off as the Hubble science briefings, and then about 10 years ago, we transitioned to Universe of Learning science briefings, where we get to talk about all of the cool science that is being done in NASA astrophysics. So that is everything outside of the solar system, which is a lot of stuff. And we get to talk about lots of different NASA missions, and we've had researchers from all around the world come and talk to you and share a little bit about their science. And this has really been a unique opportunity for informal educators to get direct interactions and ask questions to our subject matter experts. So because of funding cuts, Universe of Learning is going on a pause for a year, and we're also discontinuing the science briefings. But we hope to be back in the future with more opportunities for you. So stay tuned, especially around the launch of the Roman Space Telescope in about a year. And we'll be in touch with more opportunities for you to share NASA science with your audience. Okay, next slide, please. So today we are going to have three speakers. We have Natalie Allen, who is going to tell us about the TRAPPIST-1 system. We have Jegug Ih, who is going to tell us about how we theoretically model the atmospheres of rocky exoplanets. And then Hannah Diamond-Lowe is going to share with us a little bit about this new Director's Discretionary Time program, the Rocky Worlds program, which is going to search for the atmospheres around small red dwarf planets. And then after that, we're going to have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and then I'm going to share some resources with you. So as we go along, if you have questions, please put your questions in the chat. And it would be really great if you would note which speaker your question is for, so when we go back to that, we know who to ask. And with that, I guess we can go to the next slide. And Natalie, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks everyone for having me today. I'm really excited to chat with you guys about TRAPPIST-1, which is a system I like a lot. I am a grad student at Johns Hopkins, which is just right across the street from Space Telescope, so I'm not too far away. Next slide, please. So since I'm the first speaker today, I'm going to take the chance to, just so we're all on the same page, talk about how we observe these rocky exoplanets that all of us are going to be talking about. In order to observe small planets, right now, the main technique, and really the only technique we can use, is the transit technique. And this is kind of the geometry of the transit technique. So on the top is what you would see in the system, the planet going around the star, and then the bottom is what we call the light curve, which is what we would be able to observe. And the transit technique is really nice because it allows us to observe the star, and changes in the star allow us to learn about the planet. And since stars are much bigger than planets, it's a lot easier to observe that way. So if you move to the next slide. The main workhorse for this technique is the transit technique, which is when the planet passes in front of its host star, it blocks out a little bit of the starlight. And this depends on the relative size of the planet and the star because there's some area that's being blocked out. And that tells us how big the planet is, along with some other information. Next slide. The other technique that we use is when the planet goes behind its host star. That's called the eclipse. That's one that Hannah's going to be talking about a lot. And that tells us about the temperature of the planet. And so it depends on the relative temperature of the planet and the star. And the final way that we are kind of able, in the most time expensive way that I'm going to talk about, is a phase curve, which is when we observe when the planet goes all the way around its host star. So we use all of these different observations of these transiting planets. They all tell us different information, and they also are good for different types of planets. Next slide, please. So let's talk about TRAPPIST-1. The TRAPPIST-1 system is really a popular system, both in the field and outside of the field. It's really, I think, captured the interest of a lot of people with its many Earth-sized planets. So we think it has about 7 Earth-sized planets in the system right now. And this makes it really exciting. Next slide, please. However, even though these planets might at first seem like they're a lot like our own solar system planets, the TRAPPIST-1 system is really different than what we think of when we think of our own solar system. It's really compact. This plot is showing that all of the planets in the TRAPPIST-1 system are well interior to the orbit of Mercury. For reference, a year, so one amount of time it takes for the outer planet to orbit in this system is like 20 days. So they're going around pretty fast. Next slide, please. And the reason that the system is so compact is because the star is really small and cold. TRAPPIST-1, the star, is about the size of Jupiter. It's basically as small as a star can get and still be a star. And that makes it both, so that because it's so small, that makes it really cold. And as we just talked about, a really small and really cold star is really useful to observe transiting exoplanets. So even though these planets are really small, the signals look comparably larger because the star is so small. And so even though the system is really compact and looks quite strange, there are still planets in the system, namely planets E, F, and G, that we think could have surface conditions similar to the Earth's if they have atmospheres like the Earth's. So yeah, I think that's why we've been so excited about this system. If you advance the slide again, please. So yeah, this system is so popular that every known planet in the system has been observed with JWST thus far. We've spent something like 500 hours observing the system, which has been really great. And so I'm going to walk through what we know about each planet in the system out from the inner planet to the outer planet. Next slide. Oh, that's this JWST. Next slide, please. So let's start with TRAPPIST-1b, which is the interior planet in the system. I'm going to start each slide by telling you a little bit about the planet. So TRAPPIST-1b is just a little bit larger than Earth, but has an equilibrium temperature that's quite a bit hotter. It's about 150 Kelvin hotter than Earth's, which is something like Mercury. So you can kind of think of it as an analog to that in our solar system. Next slide. And we've observed this planet because it has a relatively short orbital period. We've observed one of those entire phase curves with this planet. We've also observed it in eclipse a few times. And these observations seem to be most consistent from emission with a bare rock. So that means it actually doesn't have an atmosphere of its own. I'm not going to tell you how we know that because Jegug is going to tell us about that, but just believe me for now. The model that seems to fit the data best seems to be something like a basaltic rock that's re-radiating its heat. So again, this is not super different from Mercury in our solar system. And that's kind of, I think, the most secure thing that we know about the system so far. This is also consistent with observations in transition, but those are a little bit more complicated, as I'll talk about in a bit. Next slide. The next planet in the system is TRAPPIST-1c, which is very similar to TRAPPIST-1b. It's almost exactly the same size. It's just a little bit cooler. It's kind of in between Mercury and Venus's temperature. Next slide, please. And this was actually observed in the same observation as the one we just talked about, the same phase curve observation. And this one's a little bit less certain. So the phase curve and eclipse observations are most consistent, again, with emission from a bare rock with no atmosphere. But this would be a bare rock that would be a slightly different surface composition than the TRAPPIST-1b, potentially a slightly different albedo or reflectivity. Or it's also consistent with a very thin atmosphere. So an atmosphere, maybe like a Mars-like atmosphere, something like that. It's pretty hard to distinguish between a very thin atmosphere and a bare rock from what we observe. So that's, yeah, it gets a lot more expensive at that point. But this is also consistent with observations and transmission. Next slide. TRAPPIST-1d is the third planet in the system. It's the smallest one we've talked about so far, about 80% Earth's radius. And this one is just a little bit hotter than Earth's, and it's about Venus's temperature. Next slide, please. And so this is kind of the transition in temperature where it becomes easier for us to observe in transmission when the planet passes in front of its host star than it is in emission when the planet goes behind its host star, because now we're in the more temperate planets. And so this is observations in transmission, and these observations can rule out clear solar system analog atmospheres, but not cloudy atmospheres. Clouds are really difficult. They complicate our observations quite a bit. Unfortunately, they're basically ubiquitous in the planets that we can observe. So it's hard to say what's going on here. It's also consistent with thin atmospheres or, again, an airless rock. However, the observations are complicated by this idea called stellar contamination, which for those of us who work on exoplanets is a big problem. You can see this a little bit in the observations labeled visit 1 and visit 2 that are on the top there. The details aren't super important, but that's two different observations of this planet. You can see that they're actually a little bit different, and the change between those observations is due to the star. Next slide. So this is just like a quick schematic of what causes that. Jegug, I think, is going to talk a little bit more about this. But essentially, these M dwarfs are really active. I think Hannah's actually also going to talk about that a little bit. But they're really active. They have a lot of flares and surface features and stuff. And so as the star changes, it actually can cause the signal that we think is coming from the planet to look like it changes as well. So that's a big complication with the TRAPPIST-1 system. So TRAPPIST-1d, still a little bit uncertain. There's still a lot of scenarios that could have atmospheres. Next slide. So now we get to TRAPPIST-1e, which is my personal favorite planet in the TRAPPIST-1 system. It's about 90% the size of Earth, but very excitingly, it has essentially the same equilibrium temperature as Earth, which is very cool. Next slide. So very excitingly, a few months ago, Nestor Espinoza and I and our team, the TST Dreams team, we call ourselves, we published observations of TRAPPIST-1e that showed what is a consistent signal through all of the visits of our planet, but we aren't entirely sure what the origin of that signal is. It could be a planetary atmosphere, but it also, again, could be due to that active host star that we were talking about. So it's a little bit complicated. If anyone's curious, well, Jegug will talk a little bit more about why this is so complicated to figure out. But luckily, these results were exciting enough that, next slide, please. We were able to get a large program. So we're following up this really exciting potential signature with a dedicated 130-hour JWST observing campaign that's using a new observing technique where we actually utilize two planets in the TRAPPIST-1 system. So both TRAPPIST-1b, that inner planet that I talked about that we don't think has an atmosphere, and so will only tell us information about the star. And we observed that close in time with transits of this TRAPPIST-1e planet, which we hope has an atmosphere. And we're kind of able to model independently remove the stellar signal and hopefully find an underlying atmosphere. With these observations, we hope to be able to constrain if TRAPPIST-1e has an Earth-like atmosphere or a similar weight atmosphere. And those observations are very much underway. Our next one is tomorrow. So keep your eyes peeled for those results in the near future. Next slide. And so that's essentially what we know about the TRAPPIST-1 system so far. TRAPPIST-1b is really the thing I think it's pretty safe to say we're most sure about at this point, probably an airless rock. C and D are a little bit more in the middle. They could be airless rocks or they could have thin atmospheres. TRAPPIST-1e, we show this, what could be an exciting potential atmospheric signal, but we're following it up with a much more dedicated campaign before we say anything for certain. And then the outer three planets, F, G, and H, have had observations taken, but they haven't been published yet. The analysis is underway. So yeah, that's what we know about TRAPPIST. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Natalie. Okay, and now, Jegug, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. And I'd like to thank Kelly and Sarah for giving me an opportunity to talk to you about modeling exoplanet atmospheres. I'm Dr. Jegug Ih. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Space Telescope. And to flow with Natalie and Hannah's talk, I will talk about modeling that's kind of directly interfaces with observations and modeling that's used to immediately interpret observations. So I'll talk about what kind of information is actually encoded in the data that we get and how modeling kind of tries to disentangle the information and extract knowledge from what we're seeing. So to begin with, next slide, please. Why do we need models in the first place? Why can't we just look at something and know what it is? So observing exoplanets is it's remote sensing in the most extreme sense. So next slide, please. So you get your data, you're using James Webb, and you get a spectrum or some observation out, and then you need to compare it to models. Next slide, please. So you run your theoretical model that encodes chemistry, thermal structures, clouds, and the actual observation themselves. And then you compare the observation with what your model predicts. And by comparing how well they match each other, that's how you learn about what's actually what you're actually looking at. So if you go to the next slide, please. And thank you, Natalie, for introducing what the kind of observing techniques that we have to look at exoplanets are. So there's eclipse, transmission, phase curves, and direct imaging. But if you go to the next slide, please. I will not talk about direct imaging because it's very hard for rocky planets. And I will not talk about phase curves simply because we don't have too many examples of those. So what you see in eclipse is the planet going behind the star, and what you see in transmission is the planet going in front of the star. And if you go to the next slide, please. So during eclipse, what you're seeing is the thermal emission from the day side of the planet. So if you think about the geometry of what we're looking at, we're primarily probing vertically through the atmosphere, through the column of the atmosphere, possibly down to the surface. And because of this, we are most sensitive to the vertical thermal structure of the atmosphere. So if the temperature is decreasing with altitude or increasing with altitude, that's the main thing that we'll be looking at. And if you go to the next slide, please. And in transmission, what we're looking at is the starlight to kind of filter through that ring of atmosphere around the planet. So underneath the atmosphere, you have a solid disk, which is the actual rock, on top of which you have a ring of atmosphere. And as at different wavelengths, because some molecules will absorb at certain wavelengths, but not at others, you'll absorb different amount of starlight. And that's how you get a spectrum out. And from that, you're most sensitive to the chemical composition of the atmosphere, typically at about 1 millibar. And that's low enough pressure to say that we kind of know what the temperature roughly is based on how bright the star is and how close the planet is to the star. So if you get to the next slide, please. So in terms of what the actual observables are and what we're actually trying to extract from it, when we're looking at emission, we're sensitive to the vertical thermal structure of the atmosphere. And what we're looking for to test if the planet has an atmosphere or not, the observed day side temperature will be generally cooler if you have an atmosphere. And similarly for transmissions, we're sensitive to the chemical composition of the atmosphere. And if the planet truly has an atmosphere, the observed transmission spectrum will show spectral features, which we often just say the spectrum has wiggles in it, rather than just being a featureless, aka a flat line. So just going to next slide, please. So they're going into a little bit more detail about how the cooler day side is working. So here in this graphic on the left, we have a planet without an atmosphere, and on the right, we have a planet that does have an atmosphere. And you can see that when you do have an atmosphere, it transports the heat, the incident heat from the star to the night side, thereby cooling the day side temperature. And if you go to the next slide, please. But that's only one effect. So there are two other effects that you also need to consider. First is that for the thermal emission at a specific wavelength, if you have a molecule that's absorbing, and that will also cause spectral features in the emission spectrum. And if you have a vertical temperature gradient, then that can appear in absorption or emission. And secondly, the molecules, because they're absorbing, they can also modulate the thermal structure themselves. So an example would be if you have a lot of CO2 in your atmosphere, that could cause greenhouse effects, which warms up your atmosphere and takes heat away from what's on top. So to model this, we typically use a 1D model that has the full column of the atmosphere, and then we're trying to balance the incident heat and the outgoing heat and radiation at each layer and try to solve for some kind of an equilibrium. So to show you what like observations and models actually look like, if you go to the next slide. So here's the 15 micron observation with James Webb of TRAPPIST-1b, which is the data point here. And then the lines are showing a different models that I've run from my paper, where I've assumed that they all have 100% CO2 atmospheres, and I'm just varying the surface pressure. So at the very top is a super thin 100% CO2 atmosphere at 0.1 millibar, which is basically airless. And then you can see that as you get to thicker atmospheres, as you go further down, your emission at 50 micron decreases as a consequence of both cooling the day side and the molecular absorption. So here, what I like this about figure, if I made it, is that the blue line and the red line shows what the cooling effect would be if there were no absorption. So if the atmosphere is purely transporting heat away from the day side, that's what they would look like. And from this, we can say the 50 micron observation is ruling out atmospheres as thick as Mars, in which case it would be the green dot here. If you go to the next slide, please. Here's another benchmark planet, Gliese 486b, which is also a rocky planet with a very good signal to noise. Here I'm showing kind of three different cases. So on top, we have surface models that are fitting the data well. And then in the middle, we have atmosphere models that's fitting the data well. In the bottom, showing atmosphere and surface models that are not fitting the data. And here, this is an emission spectrum, but the principle is the same. So if you have a dark bare rock, the planet will appear to have a hot day side and therefore match the observation. And similar with very thin atmospheres. Whereas if you have, like say, 1 bar Earth-like atmosphere or 1 bar of CO2 atmospheres or a reflective surface, because that will lower your day side emission, you can see that it's not fitting the data very well. So from this, we can infer that the planet probably has a dark, airless surface. So what are the limitations here? You go to the next slide, please. So there are false negatives and false positives. So can an atmosphere not lead to a cooler observed day side? So here, this is somewhat convoluted figure, but on the top left is what we think of as an airless case. When you have a thin atmosphere, then your day side will appear as hot as possible. And then there are all these different cases where a thick atmosphere could cause greenhouse warming, so that it actually increases the day side temperature. So despite appearing hot, it's actually a thick atmosphere. Or you kind of have some kind of aerosols or clouds in your atmosphere, which inhibit transport from the day side to the night side. And that could also appear to have a hot day side temperature when in fact there's a thick atmosphere. So this is really a question like, it depends on how exotic you believe these scenarios are. And there's more modeling to determine how likely these are as well. And to the next slide, please. As for false positives for atmospheres, the question would be, can a bare surface, which we think of as not transporting heat from the day to the night side, cause a cooler observed day side temperature? So basalt is typically a rock that we think of as like a dark surface, and it's on the surface of the moon and surface of Mercury. But then there are all these like modeling assumptions you need to make to actually determine how bright basalt surface is. So here, the default is kind of what we think of as dark, but then also there's effects of space weathering, which is when your surface is being bombarded by meteorites. Or you could also just like play with the particle size of basalt in your surface. That could also vary how bright the surface is. So there's more modeling to come that could actually determine how likely these scenarios are. And for the next slide, please. And in terms of modeling atmospheres and transmission, main thing we do is we're adding up opacities at different wavelengths from different molecules to construct these wiggles, these spectral features. And if you go to the next slide, please. And I'll compare for the same benchmark planet Gliese 486b. The observation and the models are compared here. And the flat line would correspond to the case where the planet is airless or it has a very opaque cloud deck. And you can see that these spectrum is relatively flat, but they're like kind of these like low order wiggle spectral features. And from that, we can say that it's either dominated by water or it just does not have an atmosphere. And both are statistically consistent. So next slide, please. So what are the challenges of transmission spectroscopy? So this is less of a modeling problem than more of an observing problem. But well, planets are smaller, so your signals are small. And then secondly, the atmospheres are high molecular weight, meaning they're not made of hydrogen, but instead made of nitrogen and oxygen. And because the atmospheres are made of heavier stuff, it's more compact, and therefore the spectral signal itself is smaller as well. So if you go to the next slide. And the actual modeling challenge would be the transit light source effect. So this is not just your star varying from visit to visit, but also because your planet is not covering the star uniformly, but instead it's only obscuring a specific part of the planet. If the planet, or if the star surface is inhomogeneous, then that could also give you a signal that's comparable to molecules in the actual atmosphere. Go to the next slide, please. So for Gliese 486b, and that's indeed what they found. So this like little slope that I mentioned earlier, this like low level wiggle, could equally be explained by a bare rock that's going through a stellar surface that's inhomogeneous, which is stellar contamination, or it could be explained by a water-rich atmosphere. So there's some degeneracy there. And the modeling challenge now is to actually model these stellar surfaces, which involves a lot of 3D modeling, a lot of magnetic field modeling, and those are rather difficult. And I have the next slide, please. Yes, just the summary slide. Right, hand over to Anna.
Okay, great. So Sarah, if we could skip to slide 48.
Yeah, these are just backup slides.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, great. And then Hannah, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm Hannah Diamond-Lowe, and I'm going to talk to you about a specific observing program, but that I think will draw upon some of the lessons that we've learned already from Natalie and Jegug. So this is the Rocky World's DDT program, with the goal of exploring the atmospheres of M-dwarf rocky planets. Next slide. So first of all, what is a DDT program? This is a little bit more of sort of how the sauce is made in astronomy. How do we actually get these observations? Who gets to decide what we observe? Typically, us astronomers will propose to use the James Webb Space Telescope or the Hubble Space Telescope, or actually really any telescope typically works where you have to submit a proposal and a panel will decide if this is good science to do. But sometimes you just want to make a big push in a chosen scientific direction. And in the case of JWST, the director here at Space Telescope gets a pot of discretionary time that she can allot to a specific program. Now, this is where the DDT, the Director's Discretionary Time acronym, comes from. And the idea is that these are sort of big, bold initiatives that happen every few years. But this is not decided in a vacuum, and it's actually not really decided by one person. Ultimately, the Rocky World's DDT that I'm going to talk to you about was a recommendation from a working group that was convened to come up with strategic initiatives for exoplanets with HST and JWST. So these individuals convened, and importantly, there is a public report you can read, very well written, but they also didn't, even this working group, solicited information from the outside. So this is a community initiative, and it was based on the results of 75 survey responses, 42 white papers, and 3 town halls from the exoplanet research community. And so there are many initiatives that were proposed by this working group, but the Rocky World's DDT was one of them, and the director chose to implement it. So how does this DDT work? Next slide. This is going to draw upon what Natalie and Jegug have focused on already. So this is a reiteration to say that there is this opportunity when observing M-dwarfs if you are interested in small rocky worlds. A rocky world has to kind of be a small planet. So a rocky planet orbiting an M-dwarf produces a large signal. The same sized planet orbiting a sun-like star will produce a relatively much smaller signal. There are also actually many more M dwarfs in our solar neighborhood. So those are just presenting more opportunities to detect and study these types of planets. Next slide. The TRAPPIST-1 system that Natalie spoke about earlier is a textbook example of the M dwarf opportunity in action. These are these 7 rocky worlds on orbital periods ranging from 36 hours to 20 days, including some in the habitable zone. And as you can see, when compared to the solar system that you have on the bottom there, the entire TRAPPIST-1 system fits well inside the interior of Mercury. So this is a great opportunity to get many observations of these rocky planets. But, next slide. There's no free lunch. M dwarfs also present an extreme challenge if we are interested in detecting and studying atmospheres on rocky exoplanets. This is an artist's impression, but it is illustrating that M dwarfs spend a long time in these highly active states where they are spewing out high energy radiation, coronal mass ejections, and closely orbiting planets will receive a large dose of this high energy radiation, and that can break apart atmospheres and even kind of blow them off the surface. So we don't actually know if M dwarf rocky planets writ large can retain atmospheres. So the question is, next slide, the question we've kind of come to after having many years of being excited about this M dwarf opportunity is, do rocky planet atmospheres survive their M dwarf hosts? How are we going to answer this question? So the Rocky Worlds DDT is actively working on this. So the next slide, please. But of course, we don't want to just, well, one option would be to just observe every rocky planet around an M dwarf, but that takes a lot of time. And as scientists, we like to have a hypothesis to work off of. So this is a framework called the cosmic shoreline. It has a sort of complicated name, but the practice of it, or the idea behind it, is fairly simple, which is that on the y-axis, if you plot the total amount of high energy radiation that a rocky planet receives as a function of its gravity on the x-axis. Now, gravity is a proxy for how well a planet can hold onto its atmosphere. So in the top left, a planet that does not have a lot of gravity and receives a high amount of radiation, that planet is going to have a really tough time holding onto an atmosphere and will probably be a bare rock. Whereas in the bottom right part of the figure, a high gravity planet receiving a low dose of high energy radiation will be more likely to retain an atmosphere. And so this yellow line, this cosmic shoreline, kind of marks that division of atmosphere versus no atmosphere. But a key point, next slide, is that this cosmic shoreline is derived from the solar system. So it works for the solar system. So you can see here Mercury, Mars, Venus, and Earth. Earth and Venus very happily in that region of the diagram where these planets should have atmospheres, and we know that they do. Mars kind of right on the line. It has a very tenuous but still measurable atmosphere. And then you have Mercury, which is airless. Now, we've also plotted on this diagram the rocky exoplanets that are nearby enough to study. The important piece to note, though, next slide, is that these are M dwarf rocky planets. We don't know that this cosmic shoreline that is derived from the solar system extends to the rocky planets orbiting these cool, highly active stars. And so, next slide. This is where the Rocky Worlds Director's Discretionary Time program comes in. It is a big effort on top of the effort that scientists in the community are already making to really address this question of, do M dwarf rocky exoplanets hold on to their atmospheres? It is not a purely statistical approach because we are still in a very small sample area of statistics, but it is a big push. So we're using 500 hours to do this. Next slide. Great. So how do we hunt for atmospheres around these rocky planets? There's been a great introduction of this by Natalie and Jegug. So next slide. We use this secondary eclipse. So Natalie and Jegug both talked about the planet in its orbit around the host star. We are going to focus on the eclipse when the planet goes behind its star. And we are going to use the assumption, which we think is valid, that these planets are tidally locked to their host stars. They're always presenting the same side of their of the planet to the star, much like the moon always presents the same side of its face to us. Next slide. So, case one, this planet has no atmosphere. That means the day side is constantly being bombarded with stellar radiation, and that radiation has nowhere to go. It just heats up the surface. Next slide. In that case, we would observe a very large eclipse depth. So when the planet goes behind its host star, we're missing that amount of thermal emission from the planet's day side. And if that planet was very hot, we miss quite a large amount of thermal emission. In the converse case, though, next slide, where the planet has a lower day side flux, next slide, this is indicating that there is some kind of atmosphere, some kind of fluid around the rocky surface of this planet that is transporting heat from that hot day side around to the night side. And because you have to have conservation of energy, that day side then becomes cooler. And what we would measure, next slide, is a shallower eclipse depth like this. Next slide. There's one bonus trick we can do, which is that if there is a lot of carbon dioxide in this planet's atmosphere, if it has an atmosphere, I should say, that is carbon dioxide rich, and you observe this eclipse at 15 microns, you get this extra boost, this extra shrinking of the eclipse depth, because now you are also keeping some of that high energy information from leaving the planet. So these are the kind of tricks we're using to try to observe these 9 planets in the Rocky Worlds DDT program and determine if they have atmospheres or not. Next slide. This is where James Webb comes in. JWST has this beautiful instrument called MIRI, which allows us to observe at 15 microns out in the mid-infrared. And this is how we're going to answer the first part of the Rocky Worlds DDT question. Next slide. The second piece, which is that we talk so much about these M dwarfs, we actually should go and observe them in the high energy radiation that they're emitting. So we are leveraging the unique capability of the Hubble Space Telescope, over 30 years in existence now, to measure the ultraviolet radiation from these host stars. And we can even detect things. This is an example on the left of a flare that is not from a Rocky Worlds target, but we will be getting similar types of data. So if these stars are flaring in the ultraviolet, that's extra energy they're emitting, we'll be able to detect it. And this will help us to determine why the planet we're observing may or may not have an atmosphere. Next slide. So, conclusion, this is the Rocky Worlds DDT program. It is focusing on the secondary eclipses of rocky planets orbiting M dwarfs. It is using the multi-mission capabilities we have here at Space Telescope to use JWST with MIRI to characterize the exoplanets and HST in the ultraviolet to characterize the host stars. We have a website, which I've put here at the bottom. We have our very first data sets have come in recently, and a lot more will be coming in throughout the year. So feel free to check it out. Thanks.
Okay. So
should I stop sharing and we go to questions and then reshare, or how do you want to do that?
Why don't you keep the slides up, because we might want to refer back to them if they're relevant. Okay.
Should I go back to the beginning? What do you think? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
You don't have a good question slide. I've realized in the past and haven't fixed it. Okay. So feel free to put your questions in the chat. We have a couple in there so far, so they will get their questions answered first. And then we'll move on to things that come in after that. So there is a question in here. Can you tell us a little bit about the orbits of TRAPPIST C, D, and E? So I think maybe Natalie, you can take that one.
Yeah, the orbits of the planets in the TRAPPIST-1 system are pretty interesting. The planets are actually in what we call orbital resonance. So the orbital periods of the planets are integer ratios of each other. This is actually also true for the Galilean moons around Jupiter. And because of that, the planets themselves gravitationally affect each other. We observe this through an effect called transit timing variations. This is actually how we know how massive the planets in the system are. The way that we measure masses for exoplanets is typically using a technique called radial velocities, which relies on measuring the stars very precisely. And M dwarfs, as we've been talking about, make that very difficult. And so it's actually through these gravitational perturbations in their orbits that we know how massive they are, which is pretty cool. As far as the orbits go, besides that, they're quite compact. They're mostly circular, so it's quite small perturbations that cause these transit timing variations. But yeah, there's a lot of information that we actually get from precise. We're talking about like to the second characterization of when the planets transit, which is fun.
Yeah. I mean, that's one thing that as I've been learning more about TRAPPIST-1 that really surprised me. It's kind of closer to Jupiter and its moons than it is to our own solar system, like in terms of
Yeah.
like scale and gravitational interactions and all of that. Like the star TRAPPIST-1 is just slightly bigger than Jupiter itself,
Yeah.
which is pretty wild to think about.
Yeah, and the orbits of the moons really aren't super far off from a lot of the TRAPPIST-1 planets as well. It really is much more similar to Jupiter and its system than it is to the entire solar system.
Okay, great. So another question, and I think this is open to anyone who wants to take it. Um, so can anyone say anything about what Webb is learning about Proxima b?
I can say
I,
that. Oh,
Okay.
no, Jay,
okay.
you go for it.
So I believe there was like a major debate about whether this planet is transiting or not. And the main way we would learn about this planet is if it was transiting, we would use transmission or eclipse observations. And I believe it's still not transiting. And I think that was the bottom line. But I believe with future instruments, we would be able to characterize it from direct imaging. But currently, Webb cannot tell us much. Correct me if I'm wrong, Natalie.
Yeah, it has not been observed with JWST yet. It isn't transiting, we don't think. Yeah, Jegug's right. There are potentially some techniques we could use to explore it. At least Hannah and I were on a proposal this past cycle that may, if it's accepted, may be able to help us. It's also really hard because Proxima is really close to us and it's super, super bright. This is actually, I think, kind of an interesting thing about JWST. Is JWST was originally built to look at like very faint galaxies. And we are instead pointing it at very bright stars. And that's actually kind of a problem for our observations. A lot of the time we end up what's called saturating the detector, which means we're looking at something that's too bright. The detector gets overwhelmed with photons and it actually doesn't work exactly the way we want it to. And for essentially all instruments on JWST but one, Proxima is too bright to look at.
Okay, great. So here's another question. For dayside heating, assumptions are made about the makeup of the surface, rocky, etc. What would you anticipate the effects of a water world would be on the dayside heating?
All right. Yeah, no, this is a fantastic question. So, water in even Earth's atmosphere is acting as a pretty strong greenhouse gas, even stronger than CO2. And if you had more water, and also, um, if you had a planet, if you had a water world planet that was orbiting an M star, which the flux is an infrared rather than optical, and the water absorbs even more of the light from the star compared to a sun-like star, and therefore the greenhouse warming is actually incredibly strong. So you get two effects. You get one, greenhouse warming that heats up the surface a lot, and also because the atmosphere is absorbing a lot of the stellar light, you can also have a strong thermal inversion, which is where your thermal your temperature goes up with increasing altitude. So it's a quite exotic planet, but that's what you would expect.
Okay. Another question. I've seen a lot of amateur speculation that terminator zones would be a strong potential for life in a tidally locked planets. Is that still considered true?
Well, I guess I can say that we don't have a lot of tools to assess that at the moment. So a lot of the planets that we are able to study, many of the ones we've talked about in this presentation, are quite hot. Even with atmospheres, they may not present as likely to host life as we kind of think about it based on what we have here on Earth. But it is a great idea when we have the ability to sort of study it's very tough. We cannot resolve the surfaces of these planets. So all the information that we're getting is come to us not even as all the information of the planet just kind of smushed down. It's actually we're not even really detecting the planet itself. We're detecting signatures of the planet as it orbits the star. So I think this idea is certainly we certainly have not ruled it out. But we really also aren't able to address it with our current instrumentation.
Okay, I guess along similar lines, can you talk a little bit, anyone who wants to, about the habitability of a tidally locked planet with a sufficient atmosphere, assuming the host star is a calm one, which might not be a great assumption for these red dwarf stars?
I can talk a little bit about this. We've looked into this a little bit because the planet that I study, TRAPPIST-1e, is one of these planets that it's kind of the best chance we have in a lot of ways to look at a planet that is in any way like Earth with our current observations. It's really not like Earth. The star is as different as the sun as it can get, but it's a similar size, similar temperature, but it is almost certainly tidally locked. And so that makes a very different sort of assumptions you have to make in order to make it habitable. For example, because of the difference in the light that you get from the star, in order to have an atmosphere on TRAPPIST-1e that would stay not frozen out, so it wouldn't condense out, you actually need about 100 times more CO2 in the atmosphere than you need on Earth. And that's kind of just to keep the atmosphere stable. And that leads to additional concerns because the thing about a tidally locked planet is a night side will always be very cold. If you have an atmosphere, it will recirculate heat, but it will always be colder. And again, this freeze out idea is one that we talk about a lot because it's possible that some of these species that are important will freeze out on the night side, condense out, and that makes a stable atmosphere a little bit more complicated. This happens on Mars in the winter, for example, like the CO2 freezes out of the atmosphere. So I think it's definitely an open question of how exactly it would work. In my brain, at least, we need to detect an atmosphere on a tidally locked rocky exoplanet before we kind of start to think about what that might mean for habitability. But people love to think about habitability, so there are many papers out there talking about potential ways that you could make a tidally locked planet habitable.
Yeah, and I believe like one of those speculative ideas along this line is if you had an ocean on your planet, then combined with the ocean currents and then the actual heat transport in the atmosphere, you could potentially have a planet that's tidally locked but is uniform in temperature between the day and the night side. But I think that's more of a kind of a theorist idea of an exotic scenario, but it's certainly possible.
Okay. I am not seeing any more questions in the chat. So I think that's a great opportunity to move on to our resources. So Sarah, if you could pull those back up. So we have a whole bunch of resources for you. I'm highlighting some here in the slides. On our website, we also have a full document with a whole list of resources that you can use with your audiences to talk about exploring these rocky planets around these small stars with the James Webb Space Telescope with your audiences. So to start off here, we have links to both the official website for the Rocky Worlds DDT program, which is more aimed at professional astronomers, but there's lots of really great data in there if you want to really nerd out and dig down in there. But if you want something to discuss with more of a general audience, we also wrote an explainer for nasa.gov called Can Rocky Worlds Orbiting Red Dwarf Stars Maintain Atmospheres? And there's lots of really great graphics there that you can steal and use in your own things. Everything that NASA puts out is in the public domain, so you can use it however you want any audiences. You can print it on a t-shirt, get it tattooed on your forehead, whatever you want. Okay, next slide. Here are some Universe of Learning specific resources, including the DIY Planet Search and actually Eyes on Exoplanets, which isn't Universe of Learning, but it's another science activation program. So if you want to go explore the orbits in 3D of any exoplanet that you can think of, you can get it in there, and they have sort of artist's impressions of what these planets would look like modeled in 3D, so you can fly around virtually, which is really cool. Next slide, please. So we have some interactives that you can play around with. So the first one here is from ViewSpace, and you can learn how we understand the atmosphere of these exoplanets through the transit method. And there's also a interactive where you can explore the different types of exoplanets that we know of. There's over 6,000 planets around other stars, and some of them aren't very much like the planets in our own solar system. Okay, next slide, please. So here are some program guides that you can download, and they give you activities that you can use with your audiences. What I'm going to highlight here is one that I like because I worked on it, is the Cosmic Canvas program guide. So this explores the topic of exoplanets through art making. So there's like a warm-up activity. There is an activity where you actually make a scale model of the TRAPPIST-1 system and compare that to our own solar system, and just understand just what a weird system this is. It's so teeny tiny. And also there's an activity where you can play Illustrator, and you can design you can draw your own exoplanet picture based on some prompts. So all of the pictures of exoplanets that you've ever seen, most of them are all illustrations, and scientific illustrators, get these little bits of information, and then they have to use their imaginations to imagine what these planets would look like and try to highlight these scientific features. So this is also something that you can do with your own audiences. And then next slide. And there's all of these and more on the science briefing page on Universe of Learning. Also, we will send all of you a survey after this briefing, but if you want to, you can get out your phone now. Tell us how we did. If you want to write some nice things about how much you love science briefings, now is your last opportunity to do so. And we have 5 minutes left. If we want, maybe we can go back and try to catch some of the last couple of questions that have come in on the chat as I've been going through the resources, if that is okay with everyone. Okay. Ooh, here's a good question. Exomoons. What about exomoons? How is the JWST helping with the search for moons around planets that are not orbiting the sun? Anyone want to talk about exomoons?
I can say something about it. So a lot of the planets that we observe with JWST are actually a little bit too close to their host stars for moons to be tidally active or stable. They're really like close in. Like some of the planets that we study are like they orbit on like a day period. So they're really, really close in, which makes it really hard for moons to survive. However, there is a few long period planets we know of, and there was actually a paper that was published like just a few weeks ago of a really, really long period planet. It's similar to Jupiter, and there's no definitive evidence for a moon yet, but there was tentative evidence in the light curve that they saw for what could be a moon. So we don't know anything entirely certain, but people are looking. There's other proposals that have been put in as well to try to find moons. I think everyone wants to find a moon.
Yes, so do I. I mean, not me personally, but I want someone else to find it and then tell me about it. Okay. Why don't we end on this question? I think is a good one. So how much collaboration has there been with the development of the Habitable Worlds Observatory? or large interferometer for exoplanets or a star shade. So does anyone want to talk about maybe a little bit about what the next big thing is in the Habitable Worlds Observatory, what you're looking forward to about that?
Sure, I can take this one. So there was a recommendation in the 2020 decadal survey from the astronomical community to start pathfinding the technological development we would need to launch a telescope that could directly image an Earth-like planet on an Earth-like orbit around a sun-like star. This is far out of our current technological capabilities, so this is a multi-decade project. And there is currently a lot of activity. So there are people are actively working on this, not on just the technological side, but developing the science cases, reaching out to all members across the scientific community to kind of make this happen within the next couple of decades. Ideas about interferometry and star shades have definitely been thrown around. There are pros and cons to both of those kinds of attempts. But this is going to be the sort of next flagship mission for NASA after JWST and after the Nancy Grace Roman Telescope, which is launching next year. So we're still in early development, but I can tell you that people are already extremely excited about it. We are having conferences about it. We are having meetings about it. We are trying to figure out how to get there from where we are now. So I would say there's a lot of collaboration, and we are still working on these ideas.
Okay, great. So thank you so much. And thank you to all of our speakers. You're really lovely. And thank you to all of the audience members here today. And I will say, in addition to this being the last Universe of Learning science briefing, this is also my last event. So my position was tied to Universe of Learning. And so my contract isn't renewed. And so my last day is actually the end of December. So I will miss all of you guys, everyone I've collaborated with. You all have been really lovely. And I look forward to doing some interesting things in the future.
Kelly, I know our paths will cross again.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I know we've really enjoyed the Universe of Learning series. I've only been interacting with you and the speakers for a year, but boy, I've learned a lot in the astrophysics realm and especially exoplanets realm. So know that we will be taking all of these things forward and sharing them with the public because that's what we do. We can't help it. We love it.
Exactly. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you, everyone. All right. We'll be talking soon.